When the Meridian family was found dead in their farmhouse outside Topeka in 1924, investigators discovered something that defied explanation in the dusty attic. A young man, appearing to be around 18 years old, sitting peacefully in a handmade chair. He had no mouth. Where his mouth should have been was smooth, unbroken skin that had never known the touch of lips or teeth. Medical experts insisted he should have died within hours of birth. Yet somehow he had lived for nearly 2 decades in that attic. When they tried to communicate with him, he pointed to scratch marks covering every inch of the attic walls. Thousands of words carved into wood with fingernails, telling a story of hunger, loneliness, and a family secret that had consumed an entire household from within. The Meridian family had farmed the same plot of Kansas prairie land for 3 generations. Jacob Meridian and his wife Sarah had built their reputation on hard work and Christian values, raising 4 healthy children while maintaining one of the most prosperous farms in the county. But in the spring of 1906, Sarah gave birth to a 5th child who would test every belief they held about God's plan and a parent's duty. The baby was perfect in every way except one. He had been born without a mouth. No lips, no opening, just smooth skin where his mouth should have been. The midwife, Mrs. Crenshaw, had delivered hundreds of babies in her 40 years of practice, but she had never seen anything like this. "How can he eat?" she whispered, staring at the infant's impossible face. "How can he breathe?" Somehow, the baby was breathing through his nose alone, but the absence of a mouth meant he could never nurse, never eat, never speak. According to every medical text, he should have died within hours. But he didn't die. He lay quietly in his mother's arms, watching the world with bright, intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any newborn should. "We should take him to the doctor in Topeka," Mrs. Crenshaw suggested, but Jacob shook his head. "What can a doctor do? This is God's will. We'll care for him as long as the Lord allows." Sarah pressed the baby against her chest, feeling his tiny heart beating steadily. "What will we call him?" "Samuel," Jacob said quietly, "after the prophet who heard God's voice. Maybe this child will find his own way to communicate with the divine." The first miracle came within days. Despite having no way to eat, Samuel didn't starve. His body seemed to sustain itself through means that no one could understand. He grew slowly but steadily, developing like any normal infant except for his inability to make sounds or consume food. Sarah spent hours holding Samuel, trying to understand how he survived. She noticed that he seemed most content when she held him close to her chest, directly over her heart. Sometimes she swore she could feel a strange warmth flowing between them, as if he was somehow drawing sustenance from her presence itself. The family kept Samuel's condition secret from their neighbors and the wider community. In 1906 rural Kansas, a child born with such an obvious deformity would be seen as either a divine punishment or an object of pity. Jacob and Sarah wanted to protect their son from both reactions. They built a small room in the attic where Samuel could live privately, away from curious eyes. It was comfortable and warm, with windows that let in natural light and a collection of books that Sarah hoped he might learn to read, even if he could never speak. As Samuel grew, it became clear that his inability to communicate verbally didn't mean he lacked intelligence. By age 3, he was reading the books Sarah brought him. By age 5, he was writing detailed letters to his family members, expressing thoughts and feelings with a sophistication that amazed everyone who knew him. But Samuel's letters also revealed a growing hunger that food could never satisfy. "I dream about eating," he wrote when he was 7 years old. "Not just food, but everything. I want to taste words, to swallow sounds, to consume the feelings that other people share with their voices. I am so hungry for the things I cannot have." Sarah read these letters with growing concern. Samuel's handwriting had become increasingly frantic, and his requests were becoming darker. He asked her to describe the taste of different foods in excruciating detail. He wanted to know what her voice sounded like from the inside. He begged her to explain how words felt when they left her mouth. "Bring me something to eat," he wrote in shaky letters when he was 10. "Not food, Bring me voices. Bring me the sounds that people make when they're happy or sad or afraid. I need to consume them." Jacob and Sarah tried to understand what Samuel meant, but how could they bring him voices or sounds? They read to him for hours, sang hymns outside his door, and played music on Sarah's old piano. But nothing seemed to satisfy the hunger that Samuel described in his increasingly desperate letters. The scratching started when Samuel turned 12. At first, it was just light scraping sounds coming from the attic at night. Sarah assumed Samuel was moving furniture or organizing his books, but the sounds grew louder and more persistent, continuing for hours at a time. When Sarah climbed to the attic to investigate, she found Samuel sitting in the center of the room, his fingernails worn down to bloody nubs. He had been clawing at the wooden walls, carving words and symbols into the surfaces with desperate intensity. "What are you doing?" Sarah asked, horrified by the sight of her son's damaged hands. Samuel held up a piece of paper with writing that made Sarah's blood run cold. "The words want to come out, but I have no mouth to release them. So I carve them into the walls where they can live and breathe. The walls are hungry too. They swallow the words I give them." Sarah examined the carved words more closely and realized they weren't random. Samuel had been creating elaborate stories, conversations, and poems across every surface of the attic. The walls had become his mouth, the place where his unspoken thoughts could finally find expression. But the carved words seemed to move when Sarah wasn't looking directly at them. They rearranged themselves into new patterns, formed different sentences, told stories that Samuel insisted he hadn't written. "The walls are talking back," Samuel wrote in a letter that night. "They tell me stories about the people who lived in this house before us. They know things about our family that I never knew. They're teaching me the history of hunger." Jacob wanted to put a stop to the wall carving, but Samuel became violently agitated whenever they tried to prevent him from writing. His health, which had been mysteriously stable for 12 years, began to deteriorate rapidly when he couldn't scratch his words into the wood. "Let him write," Sarah pleaded with her husband. "It's the only way he can communicate with the world. If we take that away from him, what does he have left?" So Samuel continued his carving, and the attic walls became covered with an increasingly complex web of words, stories, and symbols that seemed to pulse with their own life. If you're fascinated by this tale of isolation and impossible survival, make sure to subscribe for more stories that explore the boundaries between life and death, hunger and sustenance. What Samuel discovers next will change everything the Meridian family thought they knew about their home and their bloodline. By age 15, Samuel had covered every inch of the attic walls with his carved words. But instead of running out of space, he seemed to be finding new surfaces to write on. Words appeared in places that should have been impossible to reach, carved with precision that surpassed anything Samuel could achieve with his damaged fingernails. When Sarah questioned him about this, Samuel's written response chilled her to the bone. "I am not the only one writing now. The hungry ones who lived here before me have learned to use my hands. They are telling their stories through my fingers." Sarah began researching the history of their property and discovered disturbing details about previous owners. The house had been built in 1885 by a family named Kowalski, who had lost 3 children to a mysterious wasting disease. The children had apparently starved to death despite having access to food, as if their bodies had forgotten how to process nourishment. The next family, the Hendersons, had abandoned the house after their infant son disappeared from his crib. No trace of the child was ever found, but neighbors reported hearing crying sounds coming from the walls for months after the family moved away. Each family that had lived in the house seemed to have experienced some form of unexplained hunger or loss. And according to Samuel's increasingly frantic letters, all of those hungry souls had been waiting in the walls for someone like him to give them a voice. "They were all born wrong," Samuel wrote. "Children who couldn't eat, couldn't speak, couldn't connect with the living world. They died and stayed here, trapped in the walls, hungry for the words and sounds they never had in life. I am their mouth now. Through me, they can finally speak." The carved words on the walls began to change character. Instead of Samuel's neat, educated handwriting, different styles appeared. Childish scrawls, elegant cursive, desperate scratches that looked like they had been made by very small hands. Each style seemed to belong to a different personality, a different hungry soul expressing itself through Samuel's connection to the walls. Sarah started finding messages that were clearly not from her son. "Mama, I'm so hungry," appeared in shaky letters near the attic door. "Papa, why did you bury me in the walls?" was carved in tiny script along the baseboards. "Help us. We can't eat. We can't sleep. We can't die," covered an entire section of the north wall in overlapping handwriting. The family began to hear voices at night, faint whispers that seemed to come from inside the walls themselves. The voices were young, plaintive, begging for food and comfort and release from whatever had trapped them in the house. Jacob tried to convince Sarah that they should move away, but Samuel's health declined rapidly whenever they discussed leaving. It was as if he had become physically connected to the house, drawing his impossible life force from the same source that sustained the hungry spirits in the walls. "He can't leave," Sarah realized. "This house is what's keeping him alive. The hungry ones need him, and he needs them. They're all part of the same terrible family now." Samuel's letters confirmed her fears. "I understand now why I was born without a mouth," he wrote. "I was meant to be the voice for all the voiceless ones who came before. My hunger is their hunger. My words are their words. We are all the same starving child, separated only by time and death." The situation deteriorated rapidly as Samuel approached his 18th birthday. The carved words multiplied exponentially, appearing faster than any human hand could create them. The walls themselves seemed to be generating text, as if the house had learned to write directly onto its own surfaces. More disturbing were the messages that began appearing in other parts of the house. The same desperate, hungry handwriting showed up on bedroom walls, kitchen cabinets, and even the exterior siding. The entire house was becoming a massive book written by the dead and the dying. Jacob and Sarah found themselves unable to leave the property. Every time they tried to go to town or visit neighbors, they felt an overwhelming compulsion to return home. The house had claimed them just as surely as it had claimed Samuel and the hungry children who had come before. Their other 4 children, now grown and living in distant cities, stopped visiting after they began experiencing nightmares about starvation and suffocation whenever they stayed in the family home. One by one, they cut contact with their parents, unable to explain the terror they felt whenever they thought about their mouthless brother in the attic. Sarah aged rapidly during Samuel's final years, as if the house was drawing life force from her to sustain both her son and the growing collection of hungry spirits. She spent most of her time in the attic, reading the wall stories and having conversations with Samuel through written notes. But increasingly, Samuel's handwriting was joined by other scripts, other voices demanding attention. The walls had become a cacophony of carved words, all expressing the same desperate hunger for life, for food, for the basic experiences that had been denied to them. "We are Legion," appeared in Samuel's familiar handwriting, but the message was signed with dozens of different names. "We are the children who could not eat, could not speak, could not live. Through Samuel, we have found our voice. Through this house, we have found our mouth." Jacob stopped sleeping in the main house, moving to the barn where he couldn't hear the constant scratching sounds that now emanated from every room. But even there, he found carved messages appearing on the wooden stalls and feed bins. The hunger was spreading beyond the house itself, infecting the entire property with its need for expression. The end came on Samuel's 18th birthday in March 1924. Sarah climbed to the attic that morning to find every surface covered in fresh carving, including areas that should have been physically impossible for Samuel to reach. The words formed a massive, spiraling narrative that seemed to tell the story of every hungry child who had ever lived and died in that house. Samuel himself sat in his chair, perfectly still, his eyes closed and his hands folded in his lap. For the first time in 18 years, he was not moving, not writing, not scratching at the walls. Sarah approached her son and realized he was no longer breathing. The impossible life that had sustained him for nearly 2 decades had finally ended. But as she touched his shoulder, she heard something that made her heart stop. Scratching. All around her, from every wall, the sound of fingernails clawing at wood. The carved words were moving, rearranging themselves, forming new messages even though Samuel was no longer alive to create them. "Thank you, Samuel," appeared in fresh letters near his chair. "Now we can write our own stories." Sarah fled the attic and found Jacob in the barn, but she could not make him understand what was happening. The scratching sounds had followed her, and new words were appearing on the barn walls even as she spoke. That night, both Jacob and Sarah Meridian died in their sleep. The official cause was listed as heart failure, but neighbors who found their bodies reported that the couple looked as if they had starved to death, despite having access to food. When authorities investigated the house, they discovered Samuel's body in the attic, preserved in perfect condition despite having been dead for days. The walls around him were covered in carved words that told the complete history of the hungry children who had lived and died in that house over 4 decades. But most disturbing of all were the fresh words that appeared while investigators were present. Messages that carved themselves into the wood without any visible hand creating them. Words that spoke of hunger satisfied, voices finally freed, and a communion of the starving dead who had found their eternal mouth. The house was condemned and boarded up, but the carving didn't stop. Passers-by reported seeing words appearing on the exterior walls, spelling out stories of hunger and loneliness that seemed to call out to anyone who might understand their desperate need. Samuel's body was buried in the local cemetery, but his grave marker began showing carved words within days of the burial. Messages from the boy who had lived 18 years without a mouth, finally able to speak through stone and earth. The Meridian property remained empty for decades, but it never truly became abandoned. Local children reported seeing words appearing on trees, fence posts, and even rocks throughout the area. Always the same desperate messages about hunger and the need to be heard. Some say the hungry children are still writing their stories, using whatever surface they can find to express the words they never spoke in life. Others believe Samuel taught them how to carve their hunger into the very fabric of reality, ensuring that their stories would never be forgotten. But everyone agrees that the house on the old Meridian farm should never be entered. Because the walls are always hungry for new stories, new voices, new words to carve into their wooden flesh. And if you listen carefully on quiet nights, you can still hear the scratching. Fingernails against wood. Desperate voices finding expression the only way they know how. The question isn't whether Samuel Meridian really lived 18 years without a mouth, sustained by supernatural forces that defied every law of nature. The question is, what story your fingers would carve into those walls if you found yourself trapped in that attic, hungry for words you could never speak, and sounds you could never